All right, yes, thank you. So the East German judge has already given my talk a 10. I love it. So hi, my name is Mitch, and I'm a recovering Mongo master. Hi, I'm Mitch. I'm a recovering Joomla founder. I'm going to be talking about the Polyglot Enterprise, which it's funny. This topic actually started at PGConf in New York. Actually started a couple months before that because it started dawning on me that in the larger businesses, it's not just in the startup scenes, right, where you just can't be that monolithic stack type of company anymore. You can't be just a COBOL shop or just a Java shop. And even the startups have that problem, right? We're all kind of over-tooled, right? Over-frameworked out. So this seemed like a really good topic to discuss. So yeah, I've been called Space Monkey since probably around 1982. I've actually had 3 different groups at 3 different times in my life give me the nickname Space Monkey, so I guess I'm stuck with it at this point. So I'm a tech fellow at CapitalOne, which means I'm involved in a lot of, in a sense, I'm kind of like a professional gremlin, right? I cruise around inside this big financial company and help make change. I like to blow things up on the tarmac and running around skipping with glee and help this company transform into where it wants to go. I'm also a big contributor to open source projects. I think if I dug back far enough, I could probably find commits to the ALSA sound drivers and the 1X Linux kernels. I did some stuff with Postgres. I can't even remember what I did. It was so long ago. It was before the 7 series came out. Got involved in a content management system, now known as Joomla. It was called Mambo back then. Sorry about that. And got involved in MongoDB early on. Actually was dumb enough, crazy enough, smart enough, or maybe all of the above to launch the first e-commerce website to rely solely on MongoDB for everything. We even stored images in there. What a crazy idea. I'm a big into startups. I've been starting up companies since longer than I want to confess. I actually starting my own companies here in Seattle back in 1994, December 94 to be exact. So I lived here for over a decade and left in January of 2000 for Europe, and I haven't been back since, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to come back to Seattle. I think this is a great event too, and mad props to the folks who put DataLayer together because I think it's a great conference. I like the feel and the vibe here as well. And other silly stuff, I'm a football coach. I have no idea where that came from. I'm a musician. I studied 18 different instruments, so being a speaker inside of an inner ear is just kind of like this funny thing for me. I just had to say that. And I'm a longboarder. Actually, I blame Seattle for a lot of rusted trucks because skateboards and rain don't seem to get along very well. So wait a minute, technology at a bank. That's what every single one of you are probably thinking right now. And the thing that's interesting about CapitalOne, I'll be quick about the CapitalOne stuff. If you look at us from a finance perspective, we are, yeah. So, and I think that's very, very telling. Range of dates there. It's actually kind of cool. So I'm gonna stick my neck out and say something kind of preposterous. CapitalOne tech startup, and the reason being is because our original product, the credit card, right, was based on big data back when big data was not cool, right? We basically said there's this whole segment of people that are untouchable. No one will do any business with these people. They have bad credit, they laid off, a repo, a chargeback, something, charge-off, sorry. And so we thought, well, there's got to be a way that we can find a way to do business with a subset of these people using a sustainable model so that the company can continue to operate, but put them in a situation where they can rebuild their credit, right? And then the thinking long-term was they get good credit, they become good customers, they're loyal, and they want more financial services. And I'd like to say after 25 years, that was a pretty killer model. And it was all about chewing the data up, right? Managing that risk. How do we figure out how we can do business with people that other financial institutions won't touch? Second thing, we did an IPO, which I think is kind of funny. But this was before the craze in the 2000s, so back then that was kind of like a non-issue. We were big into direct response marketing, which is kind of unusual. Something I think that's also neat about CapitalOne today is we actually have user labs where we will bring in groups of people that we've identified to show them mobile apps, new financial services, ask them questions about why this does work, why this doesn't work. And I think that everybody that's building any kind of customer-facing product or service needs to have that kind of attention to the voice of the customer, right? Because we can build all we want. That whole build it and they come, I don't have anything else to say about that because I have a microphone and they're filming me. Recent milestones for Capital One. We've started launching cafes. The thought was people want to talk about banking. They want to figure out what they're doing, what their future is, and so we actually started building cafes. So you can come in, sit down, have a coffee and a flatbread, and talk about savings. Right? It sounds kind of silly, but it's actually really cool. I interviewed at Capital One in a cafe in San Francisco a year ago, so that was really cool. Our wallet app is like second to none. And I can say that without any pride. I have nothing to do with the mobile development teams, but I'd like to say that I think that Capital One's mobile apps are second to none. I think they're really crushing it with their mobile apps. We've acquired a couple of companies, one of them Level Money here in Seattle, and we've been bringing in some really smart small groups of people and empowering them to build big things for us. And I think that's a really cool change of pace. And we've been launching open source projects for a while now. We actually launched both an open source project and a free web service for that project called Nessie. If you go to the public GitHub and look for an org called Nessie is Real, you'll see it. It's an API that we built for hackathons. So if a bunch of students are at a hackathon and they wanted to prototype a financial app, here are the libraries to hit a REST service that we have on the web. So you can have like automatic transaction history and customer accounts and all this other, instead of just staring at line after line of lorem sporum. And there's some other cool stuff. We got some commits to some modern emerging projects like drone. For example, we have a couple people inside of Capital One that are really big on drone. A lot of us really enjoy working in the Go language, and drone is native to Go. I discovered Go actually surprisingly long ago, back in the Juju days. And this was when I was living in Europe, so I don't even know if America even knew about Juju when it happened. So everybody was giving me this kind of Juju. So it was a tool from Canonical. It's actually a really neat tool. It was an orchestration tool, funny enough, that everybody else is kind of replicating nowadays. And we migrated to the public cloud, and that's kind of a big deal. Especially in a regulated industry like finance, and an older business that's used to big data, big iron, that kind of stuff. I think that's really cool. So the obligatory slide, although I have to say the awkward slide, I don't think smart quotes parse in JSON, but I didn't have a chance to debug it. I was getting ready to talk, but yeah. So the glory years, right? We go back to the enterprise. Why are we talking about the enterprise? Enterprise 1.0. We had one stack to rule them all, right? And I think Wall Street is a real good example. They were all writing C code that was living on Solaris boxes, and they were all using Sybase for the databases, because that was the vendor everybody got in bed with first, I guess. And then a couple 100 million lines of TSQL code later, now you're really stuck. And that was basically a situation that they were in. The good news was that you certainly had standards. You only needed one or two because you were only using a handful of tools, right? There was plenty of time for, filling out TPS reports and all the other stuff that we all see on XKCD and Dilbert and whatnot. And yeah, the funnest part is about scale. Back then when you were building an app, maximum traffic for you was what, 200 concurrent users? So scale was really about, how many months are they going to be bringing us free coffee and donuts in the morning? And this one actually is, I'm going to get cheeky for just a minute here. That really was the plan, right? And Anonymous was famous for saying, nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And, Anonymous was then heard saying other stuff and some other stuff and yet some more stuff. And then in the end, it just kind of, Anonymous went away. But, and then here comes this rumbling in the distance, right? And suddenly building apps in an enterprise environment totally changed. And how that worked was, first you went from concurrent users, you went ludicrous speed, right? All of a sudden now you plug this thing in and you got all kinds of problems. And the projects themselves, right? I mean, I remember joking even way back in the early 2000s, if I ever had a customer walk up to me and say, Mitch, just build the app. Take your time, just do it right, do your research. And when you're done, let us know and we'll go live. I would drop dead of a heart attack right there on the spot. Because every project was hair on fire, we're all going to die, I needed to launch it last Tuesday kind of thing. This was actually something that I got really exhausted with in the early 2000s, because that was really an explosive time where a lot of languages were starting to gain traction, and those languages were bringing in their own frameworks and their own tooling and everything else. Let's see. Yeah, and there you go. You need to go multiple routes to get apps into production at that point. And this is where this talk is actually headed in specific. And the most important part about this is I wanted to make a point about it not being a different set of skills. It was an entirely new set of skills, right? It used to be, you have someone who basically built front end, and you had someone who did design, and someone who did the back end stuff. And when you started a project, the back end guys immediately were like, yeah, let's design our database now. And you disappear for 3 months. And man, those days are gone, right? They're long gone. Now you have a handful of people, and they're all basically doing the same stuff. And just whoever's available and not exhausted from the last sprint. And then again, there's the whole backwards compatibility issue, right? So now when you start using another tool, you have to worry about if the version of the tool you're using is going to work with the other stuff that you got to hook into, and if any of that stuff gets upgraded, whoops. And that's the last part. Thank you, Google. Yeah, we'll just slap beta on there, and then we don't have to support anybody. And that had its own issues. Speaking of cache, right? And yeah, I'm from a bank, but I'm not talking about that kind of cache. This was basically what our options were back in the day. We have a couple more options now, right? And DevOps, right? That's another question. How do you deal with all of these tools and toolkits and frameworks and orchestration layers? And that's something that is a major challenge the bigger your organization gets and the larger your engineering teams get. So yeah, we have a few tools available. I see there's an Ansible sticker, and I saw a Gulp t-shirt there. We have a handful of people that are pushing some of this stuff. And we're all using all of this, right? And maybe that's part of the problem, because the number of deployment tools back in the day to bring an application into production, I could count them on one hand and probably not use any fingers, right? And now, unfortunately, I would need a larger wall to show how many tools are needed, right? So, the problem is, how long can we continue in this crazy pace of kitchen sink everything, right? I want to use this language, I want to use that framework, and we're going to plug into that database layer, and you know what? We're going to break that apart, and we're going to use this service in between, and then the business people show up, right? And they start making their own requests as well. And of course, this starts out kind of innocently enough, right? You have someone from the business side saying, listen, we got to get this product up. Our biggest competitor is about to announce theirs. And then you get the front-end hipster. I love to beat up on the front-end hipster. I lived in New York for 10 years, so I was surrounded by front-end hipsters. And mock turtlenecks. Oh, man, no more mock turtlenecks, please. And then they're saying, well, okay, maybe I need some help. And, well, maybe that wasn't exactly what we were looking for in the first place. Okay, we'll just, whatever. And then the marketing guy says, well, it's got to be web scale. And sales gets involved, and they make the usual, we just need you to hook into a couple systems for us, just a couple. It's what everybody else is doing. And you're sitting there and you're thinking, And then last, the executive team steps up, right? And the conversation starts out good, and then at the end you're like, is this part of this Terry Tate office linebacker commercial from the day? Sorry, football reference. So this slide here is for everybody who has to sit through all of those conversations. In the startup scene, I had to sit through those conversations almost daily, right? And one startup I was in was founded by 3 capricious Frenchmen. And they would literally come into the room. One would come up to the engineering team, and he would clap his hands in a way only a Frenchman can do. And then everyone would look up from their laptops and, what? And half of us are scraping crust out of our eyes. And we're like, someone's doing something? And he would say, I need rounded corners and drop shadows today. And then he would turn and leave. And all the engineers would look up at me like, Dad, don't let them do that to us. And I would have to pull him aside and say, okay, it's not like that. And I really did feel like I was just there at the beach, swinging like mad with my broom, but the waves were just too many. So I wanted to get into a couple of things that I've learned over the years that work in this kind of setting and again, this is not necessarily a technical talk. I'm totally happy to talk tech with anyone here after this session, but yeah, this talk is really more about the concept of a polyglot enterprise and what you have to do to survive in that environment. One of them, probably the most powerful one, is the way you build your developer community inside the business. How many of you, actually show of hands, how many of you are in a large business right now, large enterprise? All right. And out of you, how many of you feel like you're siloed off and tossed into almost like a deep, dark cave in the cavern somewhere and you never get to talk with anybody else? Okay, a couple. That's a great sign. That's very heartening. Developer community is like the easiest way and the most powerful way you can change the way your team works. And one of the ways is to get out of this whole knowledge transfer concept of the old days, right? What you really need to do is try to find those people that are on your teams that are exceptional at a particular tool and turn them into mentors. You have to turn them into more social. You have to have those brown bag lunch and learn sessions, because you never know. In a large organization, especially CapitalOne is very much a polyglot enterprise. We have every language, and I mean every language, every framework, every tool. It's kind of funny. One group had something like 28 different databases listed as something that they would recommend for use on their projects. And but you know what? We're coming up on almost 7,000 engineers on staff. That's a lot of nerds. That's a big herd. And somewhere in there is someone who's forgotten more about Java than I'm ever going to learn. Somebody in there is way more adept doing anything with Python than I'm ever going to figure out on my own. You got to find these people and you have to promote them, right? You have to find ways to get them in front of other engineers so they can share that knowledge, share those tricks. Another thing is you have to focus on your onboarding. I'm going to talk about that later in this talk, and I think that's really important. When you bring in engineers to your environment, you have to make sure that when they show up, you set the standards, you set the expectations for them. This is not code, 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 commit, pray, code, 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 commit, pray, right? Those days are gone. You can't do that here. You need to set those expectations up front, but you also need to show them and give them the tools and the framework to live in so that they can accomplish all of these expectations that you're putting on them, especially if they're new to some of these expectations, right? A lot of developers will show up and say, CI/CD, why? You need to make it dead simple for them to do this. If you make them go out and manually set up their own Jenkins installs or anything, that's like the worst, I think, is promoting someone to Jenkins sysadmin when they really just wanted to write code. So make sure you put your tooling in place so that it's easy to onboard these engineers in a sane environment where they're productive and happy and also achieving what we're trying to do as a group. And then the last thing, I think, well, not the last thing, but second to last, but it's still really important, is make sure that everybody that's coming into the company sees that there is a place for them to grow inside of the business, right? Something, when I started my career longer ago than I'm going to confess on stage, you didn't have a career path. Your career path was work here for a couple years, earn some street cred, leave and go somewhere else, get promoted when you leave, and then work there for a couple years, earn some street cred, leave, get a promotion when you take your next job. So longevity in a particular place was not good. And in today's world, in order to get long-term stability in your engineering organization, you need that continuity. You need people to stick around and feel like they're going to have a career there. You really do need to get that point across with them so they understand this is not a stepping stone. This is not a place where you can just pad your resume and then bail to the next opportunity. Another thing is open source. Open source can teach all of us a lot more than just software, right? I remember working on a lot of projects early on, and I took everything for granted the way it worked. And then one day it dawned on me. I was sitting in my apartment in Brooklyn, and I was working on a team that had folks in Australia, Malaysia, Germany, France, Poland, the Netherlands. Can't leave out the Dutch. They'll never let me live that down. And I'd be banging my head on a problem all afternoon trying to solve this. And eventually I'd be like, guys, I got to go to sleep. I can't continue. And Australia's like, okay, I'll pick it up. Good day. And then I'd go to sleep. And I'd wake up in the morning, and not only had my problem been worked on by the Aussies, but then if they had solved it, they were done, they were moving on to something else. Or they couldn't get it done. They handed it off to the Germans when they went to sleep. And when I wake up, it's a whole new set of stuff to worry about. So these open source projects are open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, if you think about it. But it means you have to have really good communication. You have to have really solid policies and practice in place so that everybody knows what the rules are. You don't get any surprises. And you can learn a lot in building your organization from open source projects. And the last thing I'm going to talk about with regards to developer community is diversity. This is a really big problem. One of my colleagues, Jackie Kazil, she comes over from the Python Foundation. She's involved in a lot of Python stuff, women in tech. Like that's a sticker I got, yeah. And she always talks about diversity, and I always thought to myself, why does she have to be the one that's always talking about diversity? So I'm going to talk about diversity. And the reason being is because it's easy to dismiss people that talk about diversity if they're part of the people that are suffering from the lack of diversity, right? So you look at me and you can pretty much put 2 and 2 together and realize I'm on everybody's hit list, right? So I'm standing here in front of all of you telling you diversity is an issue. It's not just doing it because it's right, which should be enough, right? That's enough for me. Do it because it's right. But think about this. I've started companies, I've had a couple startups where, one particular startup, I just got really lucky and I found a small, talented, diverse team. And this team had a different DNA from all the other teams that I'd put together that were more homogeneous. This team was invulnerable to groupthink and a lot of other stuff that happens on teams when these teams start to grow. Nepotism, favoritism, cronyism, all the isms, right? This team was like ism-free. And a lot of it was just because of the diversity on this team. This group didn't approach problem solving the same way. They didn't approach mentoring with each other the same way. And yeah, I can't tell you enough how important diversity is on your teams. So back on the technology side of the talk. So one of the things that you can do to deal with being in a polyglot enterprise on the technology aspect of things is to focus on using stack agnostic tools, right? You need to be able to support multiple languages. This is one of the biggest things that I've had to overcome personally, because I'll be working with a lot of projects, getting sucked into MongoDB early on. I also got sucked into Node.js early on. And so there's a lot of tools in the Node world that help you do things. And they're very JavaScript specific, but they're good. You can use them for other languages too, but they're actually better. They're really suited for Node projects. Ruby had their own stuff, right, with the Capistrano and everything on that ilk. And Python had some tools, and PHP had Fing. Sorry, that was a mean-spirited joke. But thankfully, nobody here uses PHP. Is that the case? I guess so, because no one got my joke. So one of the things that you can't do is get wrapped around the axle with 50 different orchestration frameworks, because I need this one for my Python projects, and this one for my Ruby projects, and this one for my Node stuff. Try to find toolkits that are agnostic to those languages and frameworks that you're using. And one of the things that you're going to find as a benefit of doing that is that the logic that you're building is logic that can be reused across the organization regardless of what kind of tech is being used in that particular app or stack or whatever it is. And that's a big deal. That's also part of that whole get developers to communicate to each other, right? Larger organizations, you'll see, for a bunch of different reasons, you'll have different groups of engineers that just don't talk to each other for whatever reason. And honestly, the reasoning, it doesn't really matter. The real problem is they don't talk to each other. And if you're using a common toolkit for orchestrating all of your deployments, for example, then you start to see your developers sharing template files, CloudFormation files, Terraform files, and whatnot. And that helps bridge that gap. So you're actually getting 2 birds with 1 stone on that one. Another thing is you're sharing knowledge across those teams. You might have someone in this team over here, team A, and they're just extremely adept at writing Terraform scripts. And what you'll find is that someone over here in team D is going to start contacting that person and saying, hey, I'd love it if you could help me with this project. That's a Python project for data science people. I have no idea how we're going to do this stuff in production. I don't know how to build this stuff. And they just sit down and hammer this stuff out. So this is a wonderful opportunity to share that knowledge across the teams. Public cloud infrastructure. Here's an interesting thing that happened that I saw, not just at CapitalOne, but at other companies, is using cloud infrastructure gives you an opportunity to standardize a lot of your operational stuff, right? When you're in a data center, it's easy to say, just like your programming languages, it's easy to say, okay, all these apps are going to be running on Red Hat. I'm going to use these tools over here. This stuff is going to be using Ubuntu. I'm going to use all of these other tools over here. But when you're on the cloud, it's basically easy to say, I'm going to use this for my monitoring. I'm going to use this for alerting. I'm going to use this for logging. And it's for all the things. And that's a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. Another thing is you can automate scale. And pretty much every public cloud vendor out there has some sort of mechanism for you to automate scale. And the reason why I say that with a gleam in my eye is because it provides a fringe benefit. When you're in the regulated industry, you have some issues, right? For stuff I build at Capital One, for example, there are very real expectations that the government gives us. And if we don't meet those expectations, then we lose our right to call ourselves a bank, for instance. So there's just things we have to do. And one of the policies that a lot of companies in the regulated market are, and healthcare as well, okay, Amazon specific, how about AMI images? You can't have an AMI image that's greater than X days, because that means you've had to manually apply patches and whatever. We'd rather you just fire up a new instance using a fresh AMI, plop your app on it, and restart it, right? It sounds like a great idea until you try to automate it. That's a real hassle. But, okay, to stick with the Amazon example, and you can do this on Google and Azure as well. With Amazon, what you end up doing is you'll set up an autoscale group, and if you build your deployment scripts to use a fresh version of the AMI, you can actually tell your autoscale group anything over 60 days, zap it. And what ends up happening is it'll say, hey, look at that. Instance number 1 of this stack is stale, and it terminates it. And then autoscaler says, wait a minute, we're supposed to have another instance, and fires up a new one using the new AMI. And your code deploys on it, bada bing, bada boom. And that kind of automation is huge. We were talking about this before we came into this room. I was talking with a couple people, and the discussion was, why is it that larger businesses are just so much better at automating all the things? And I always felt like it's kind of necessity for survival when you have that many people doing that much stuff, right? And if all of our developers had to manually do all of the things that we do to make our apps acceptable for running in a production environment, we'd never be building apps. We'd be deploying for a living. So being able to automate all of this stuff is a really big deal. Okay, we'll talk about some random stuff. Another thing is, Capital One is a good example. It's almost like a tech company that thought it was a finance company and just realized, oh crap, we're a tech company. And it's very, very, very much into technology right now. And that enthusiasm can lead engineers to decide, I'm just going to build it myself, right? Yes, we can. And the problem with that approach is that there's a lot of stuff that could be used across the entire organization. And sometimes I'm asking engineers, okay, is this key to the company? Is this something so special? Is this like special sauce that we don't want anyone else to know about? We want to own it? Or is this just a toaster? And if it's a toaster, I don't care where it's made or how it works. I just burn my bread, thank you very much. And making that pragmatic decision and using that across the entire organization is a huge win for everybody. I've seen big companies do that with stuff like CI/CD, SCM platforms. You know, everybody either fires up a GitLab instance somewhere, or they'll use, I'm a big Redmine fan. GitHub Enterprise is another one that everybody seems to use. Knowing which tools to just standardize and let everybody use and make it like a all-you-can-eat service is a very important skill in the enterprise. Another thing is instead of worrying about the tools, it's more about the philosophy of how you're building applications, right? What's really important about building good applications? Is it the language that you're using? Is it the framework that you're using? Is it the database that you're backing it up? Or maybe is it the way your developers are building and designing their systems? And sometimes focusing on the way the developers build and design those systems will have infinitely more value to the enterprise than the actual code they produce. Yeah, this is a big one of mine. I can't stand it. Can't stand it. You want to see me outside kneeling on the pavement, just banging my head until the police come and take me away to the hospital? Just keep saying our DevOps team, because it's not a team. DevOps is something that should be part of every single project that's happening inside of your organization. And actually, this doesn't matter if you're an enterprise or a startup or a SMB. Ultimately, you need someone with those skills on every single team. The days of deploying your apps via UDP protocol, you write your app, you throw it over the fence, and then you run away before the screaming gets too loud. Those days are over, right? You have to be able to think about what it takes to deploy your apps. When you think about writing code, you can't think about, well, it runs on my laptop. That's another one that gets me kneeling on the sidewalk, banging my head into the ground. Oh, it runs on my laptop. Well, thank you, but your laptop is not at Amazon. So these are really important, really important practices that you need to have, and resist that urge to build a team of DevOps. Add people with DevOps skills to your existing teams and make that part of your organization and not just a siloed group. This one's actually a big one, and it's a lofty goal. Challenge your onboarding teams which in turn, of course, infuriates all of your tech leads because they're the ones that get stuck building all the all the stuff for this. But ultimately, what you want to do is when you onboard an engineer, you want them to walk through that process of building an app, getting it tested, QA'd, staged, and deployed in their first week there. And it can be a hello world, it can be whatever. And the whole reason why is because when they walk out of that first week, you've just helped indoctrinate them into this process of, I'm writing code that's going to be running somewhere else, right? Understanding that I need, there are some CI/CD platforms that gamify this with the badges too. I love it. Getting developers that are excited about the happy green check mark in the front of their repos. It sounds silly, but you know what? Whatever it takes, man. I just want them to test their code, right? So you can do a lot of different tricks to get them to do that kind of stuff. I managed to rattle about as fast as I could through this deck. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to kind of break away with tradition here and ask for questions. I wasn't sure if that was something I was going to be doing. But the whole purpose of this talk was really to kind of expose what a Polyglot Enterprise is, what are some of the problems that have to be overcome. Sure.
When you're making a technology decision about adopting something new, do you think that should be something that happens on a team level? Like one of the teams decides they need to use a new database or whatever? Or should that be like more of a company-wide thing, and how do you tell the difference?
The problem with doing stuff company-wide is when you get more than, say, 50 people, who's going to be the person that makes that call? When I first started working at CapitalOne, I introduced a tool that nobody else in the side of the company were using. And in fact, the few people that had come to CapitalOne that wanted to use it were told they couldn't because it violated policy or wasn't this or wasn't that. And I said, well, let's just run a pilot. And when I started running this pilot, a couple hundred developers started using this tool. But there were a bunch of others who had found open source tools and they felt really emotional about that decision and they wanted to do this stuff. And I was talking with a couple other people in my group, the tech fellows, and I said, so who's the person that's going to be able to say you should be using this tool or you should be using that tool? And one of the guys, Colin is his name, really smart guy, he looked at me, smiled, and he says, do you want to be that guy? I was like, no, I don't want to be that guy. I want to be somebody else. And he laughed. He says, yes, exactly. That's a problem. And that's actually what happens in the larger organizations is it'll start, actually, you know what? The large organizations that are really functional that I've been involved in were all really federated, right? They were either segregated by organizational unit, like countries. I've been in companies like a million years ago, I found myself a chief security officer for a 150-year-old German sea freight logistics company. That was a weird experience. And their whole business was divvied up into countries. So each country had their own CTO, CEO, CIO, and everything else. And it completely worked. And other companies that are big companies that are just like a big American business, for instance, might break up their company into lines of business. And each one of these groups might have their own specific way they like to roll, right? They might have restrictions based on whatever. They might be product-centric. Like we have groups inside of CapitalOne that all they care about is Node.js apps because they're just building web app. You have other groups that all they care about is Python because they're data sciences and that's where all the tools are. So if I was to go to them and say, you all have to use this tool, oh man, I don't want to be that guy. Right? So yeah, you need to federate it to a point. I think that maybe a smarter approach is to try to be more of a community and allow these teams to build something and then demo that inside of the company to other groups. And if it's something that's really that has traction and value to everybody else, then that's something that's going to be adopted more widespread.
One of your bullet points suggests transforming specialists into mentors to help disseminate knowledge to the organization. I found that people who are specialists are also the ones who have typically more stringent demands on getting pulled into projects. Do you think that there's organizational complexities to try and establish a culture of people teaching, or how do you deal with conflicting priorities of people who can do special things? You want to stop them doing that to go teach other people to do special things, and how do you get the organization to recognize that you might slow down to speed up later?
Okay, so the question is converting specialists into mentors, how do you offset the cost of the specialists not working because they're too busy mentoring instead? And I'm actually going to stick my neck out and maybe overshare. Our CEO at CapitalOne does talks every year, and the guy is indefatigable. He will go on stage and go for 6 hours. It is awesome. And one of the things that I noticed in his speaking style that I thought was just really genius, and I just lacked the skill to emulate, or I'd do it myself, is that he would talk about how the company had been presented with a problem, and there was a short-term gain that said, this is what you want to do, right? This is how we're going to make profit. This is how we're going to make the board happy. This is how we're going to make Wall Street happy. This is how all the analysts and everybody are going to be happy. But that wasn't the right thing to do. The right thing to do would not make any of those people happy, but we knew that it was the right thing to do, and it came at a cost. And he says, well, because I'm me and I'm a little silly that way, that's what we did. We did the right thing. And then he manages to come back and says, oh, by the way, 5 years later, we discovered that because of that thing that we did, and then he rattles off all the different things that suddenly made this a really smart idea, right? And he did it like 4 or 5 stories in a row, and I was blown away with the way he was talking about these things. And this is actually one of those scenarios where you have to ask yourself, okay, is the short-term gain of keeping my specialist at his keyboard, coding away like a fiend, outweighing the benefit of perhaps taking your specialist away from their keyboard long enough to put some material together and give a talk somewhere, have a brown bag lunch and learn, or we have water cooler talks, for example, where people take turns. We even have this it's almost like a gong show. It's kind of funny. In one group, they have people come in and they'll do like 5 to 10 minute lightning talks. And we actually play different DJ music in between the groups when they're taking the stage, and they get to select what songs to play, and it's a lot of fun. And the whole reason behind that is to get these people out there so you say, oh, wait a minute, we're using this? I didn't know we were using, oh, wow, they know more about this than me. I want to know what they're doing. And that kind of stuff happens. A light bulb moment happens every time that kind of stuff happens. So for me, I think it outweighs the benefit. For me, the biggest challenge is a lot of these specialists have no interest in talking to a group of people, right? They're specialists because they want to sit back in the darkest part of the office and just write code and keep their earbuds in, or not even come into the office. They'd rather just telecommute and bang out code. So that's another challenge for converting your specialists into mentors. In the back.
So, one little line on there about agnostic deployment.
Yeah.
And I'm struggling to think of something other than Jenkins. So what do you guys actually use for agnostic deployment? Because by nature, deployment tends to not be agnostic. Because if it was agnostic, we just fling it into /home blah blah, and it would work.
The funny part is at CapitalOne, we're using all of the tools. You could probably make up a tool, and I'll find someone inside of CapitalOne somewhere using it. That said, so talking about CI/CD, for instance, my favorite is for deployment in particular. Drone does it like it's nobody's business, right? It's Docker native, does a lot of things really well. The UI needs some time in the oven. Still a little squishy inside, but soon, someday. But yeah, we're using all of those tools, and the more automated and simple the tools, I think what you need is approach. Probably 90% of the projects that we take on are proof of concepts, pilot project. We're just trying something, and you need to give them the simplest and easiest way possible to integrate all of these tools into their platform that they're building. And then there are other big apps, the core stuff. And that has more sophisticated requirements. Canary deploys, blue-green deploys, that kind of stuff. And that's where your tooling gets a lot more sophisticated. And that's the stuff that typically becomes more vertical and more niche, right? So it's a balance across all of the above.
So related to that, the slide said centralize the stuff.
Some stuff, yeah. Well,
What aspect of it, like the horizontal pieces, is it just giving up to AWS or container deployments?
it's a mix across all of the different groups.
Right. So
We federated, right? We federated the way we use tech. So you might have this line of business over here is just they fell in love with Jenkins, and that's what they like to do because they built, and this happens. They built a ton of tooling around Jenkins to do exactly what they need. They might have a proprietary tool that they use because, to satisfy regulatory requirements, they might have to have some kind of, 2 keys before you can go live,
Yeah, but
right?
they don't have their own SMTP server.
Correct.
Right. So it's a different category. It's kind of federated around, or it's centralized around a culture that's important for the federated. Okay.
Yeah.
Just wanting to clarify how that works.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So what we've done is, and this is something that I think is kind of neat that Capital One did. When they reached that point where they said, just sitting around waiting on vendors all day, it kind of sucks. Let's do it ourselves. We should be doing this. And they did something that I haven't seen many large businesses of that scale do. They actually said, you know what, we don't really have the chops to be able to say, this is how it's going to be done. This is the official Capital One way. This is the official Capital One tool. And we just said, go out, do, explore and play and build. And the stuff we're good at, we're going to leverage. And the stuff we're not good at, we need to get better. And so you have different teams and different lines of business inside of the company that will use different tools to do ultimately the same thing. And the big picture view of this is, hey, I just want all of our developers writing tested code. Right? I want to know that this code is deployable. Something that, okay, this is something that I'm going to bring up. I'm going to beat up on Node for a minute. A lot of other apps, Go is something that does this really well. When you're wanting to build an app, you can literally compile a binary based on a particular architecture, but you can say, I want these other architectures too. So on my Mac, I can say, build this app, and while you're at it, I want a Linux 64 and a Windows 32 build as well. And then I tar that up, and that's my artifact that I deploy. That is so much easier than, for example, the Node notion of checking out the code on a server somewhere and then running npm install and then coming back in an hour. And the problem is the developers that do this, they'll fire up npm install and then they'll go eat lunch or build a log cabin or whatever, and then they come back and it's done. And that's great for them. But you know what? If your group is running their own CI/CD cluster, right? And you got 6 containers. And this one project has 8 pull requests. That's it. Your whole CI/CD platform is gone for an hour plus, right? And so I've been talking with some folks in the Node community saying, how can we get around that? Because what happens is you can't build a tarball, for example. You can't just add all of your Node modules files into your project in your repo and then pull that onto a server, because some of those are going to have platform-specific binaries, right? Show of hands, how many people here are working with Node? Okay. Yeah, whenever you do an npm install Mongo, npm install Redis, npm install Memcache, you're pulling down a platform-specific binary inside of that package. And so what I've been begging the npm folks to do is, instead of saying, oh, you're on a Mac, I'm going to give you this one, or oh, you're on Linux, I'm going to go grab you that one, I'd like it to just grab the package that has all 3 platforms in there. And then when it runs, it says, oh, I'm on OS X, I'm going to use this binary, I'm going to use this client because this is Ubuntu. That's what I'm looking for. And that's something that's been my biggest source of indigestion with CI/CD, is actually just figuring out how to move some of these emerging platforms out, because they weren't designed for the deployment, they were designed for the building. And they're great at the building. And it's the same thing when Ruby on Rails came out. I remember when prototyping Ruby apps was awesome, because you did something that nobody else was doing, right? Remember my joke earlier when we're going to build this app, and then the other guys would, okay, let's build a database. And these apps were awful, right? Nobody wanted to use these apps. These apps were terrible, comically bad, Ben Stiller bad. And then the Rails folks came up and said, you know what? Get the nerds out of the room. Thank you. I'm going to sit down with this person because they're the customer. Hey, customer, what do you want to see? And you would scaffold your app there. And from a language perspective, they cleaned all of our clocks, right? In the early 2000s, Ruby on Rails was the bizzle. And the reason behind that was because they took a user-centric mode of design. Deploying those apps, however, were a total nightmare. And if you think about it, Node's kind of followed in that same arc, right? Building Node apps is, gosh darn it, it's so easy. So quick. npm install star. Anyway, but I'm ranting on that one. Sure.
So do you have any specific measures that you could recommend for, I guess, quantifying risk for investment in mentorship? Like, in other words, how do you justify that investment to metrics-driven management or investing in mentorship?
that's something else that has to happen inside of the organization, right? Your leadership needs to be brought on point with what needs to be happening with your teams and the folks down in the trenches, so to speak. And if you're in a very hierarchical organization, that challenge gets, the taller the pyramid gets, the more difficult that challenge is. But really, you know, another thing is in the enterprise, I remember in the enterprise when, if you were a technology person, you were never going to get higher than director. That was the end of the line for you. That was it, right? And I remember even in the, yeah, I'm that old, in the 90s, I remember there was no such thing as a CTO. There's a person called the CTO, but nobody listened to him because they weren't the CFO and the CIO. So yeah, working on the organization, the leadership of the organization, so that they understand why it's so critical is super important. Super important. So I handed way in the back.
Well, I'm asking this just so it's on a video so my boss can listen to it later. What is the environment, what is the mindset of the people that are making, you know, the money people making decisions of what, you know, our shop is going to look like, how we're going to work? What is the environment that is needed for them to actually realize that the things you're saying are important? What mindset, where do they need to be to start realizing that changes need to be done so that we have this oasis that you talking about?
Thank you for that question. One of the biggest challenges that everybody here is a technology person, right? I doubt. Oh, yeah. So the question is, how do you convince management and leadership in your business that these practices have value and that they're worth the investment, they're worth the effort, they're worth the loss of productivity and time to do X, Y, and Z? And truth be told, the real challenge here is on us. We've done an awful job of selling this stuff to leadership. You know, marketing can be all about numbers. Sales can be all about numbers. Statistics, finance, they all have a really easy argument. But for us, sometimes it feels like being an insurance salesman, right? So the onus is on us. My approach is, if I think that my organization should be doing something and it should be important, I need to convince both the people that need to be following this practice that it's important and valuable to them to do it, but also their leadership so that they understand they need to encourage and promote this kind of behavior or this practice or this strategy, this philosophy inside of the business. Because if you can't sell it, then you have very little chance of finding an ally in a leadership position to help make that happen, right? I invite everybody else to start taking that same mentality, right? When you're coming up with and we've all had that moment, right? Why don't they just get it? Why don't they understand? It makes so much sense. But if we don't sell it, then it doesn't get bought. Yes?
Do you have any suggestions for tools or processes regarding actually applying, like, say, the scientific process to, like, what tech stacks you'll invest in so you don't, you know, repeat the same process over and over again of realizing, you know, problems with a certain thing, and so you can share that across an organization, the learnings, you know, from your experiments?
Yeah, so the question is there some way of, you know, anecdotal evidence of a particular choice of stack or an architecture and why it was made and why it was a good decision? Metrics-driven engineering and architecture, right? I've always been a huge fan of qualifying decisions being made. I used to work in a startup in New York called Kick Apps. They built and I love the name, Kick Apps. And their logo, the K was kicking the top of the I. So everybody had to wear soccer jerseys at conferences. Oh, I hated those jerseys. They were like the shiny velvet. I was like Liberace, the goalie. But the startup was fun. And I worked with a guy in product named Chris Keene. Chris was awesome because he was like the Marquis de Sade of product management. He was so cruel. You'd come up to him with the most beautiful idea. Why don't we do this? Let's add this. And he would look at you and he'd say, is it going to increase conversions? Does it help with user retention? Does it get us out of the long tail into the paying market? Does it, you know, mitigate security risks? Does it solve our cache problems with, you know, our media distribution, CDN? And if you ever came up to him with an idea that felt and sounded really cool, but you didn't have any data to back it up, oh, you were gone. It's over. And he was so brutal, but he really beat that into my head. The original project lead for the Mambo project, Rob Castley, he was the same way. I remember Andrew Eddy and I and a bunch of other guys. We would code, and build the most beautiful stuff all week. And then we would push it into CVS and Subversion because Git didn't exist yet. And we'd come in on Monday and we'd hook up on Skype and cry on each other's shoulders, virtually, because Rob was like, "What's too complicated? Nobody wants that. I don't even know what that is." And he just chucked everything. And I think that it's really important to be able to take that kind of, show me the money approach. When someone says, "Hey, let's do this," you say, "Okay, why?" You have to be the annoying toddler. Why? Well, because it's going to do this. Well, why? But if you can get through like 3 or 4 whys and still get everybody saying, "This is a really good idea," you got something. So that would be my approach to that.
Can you paint a picture of a couple of decades ago, one technology, one language, now we have this proliferation, and you're saying you recognize and embrace. For the next 2 decades, how do we find balance and rein that in? Because if it continues, and it's going to continue, right? But you've got 20 frameworks to do one thing in one language and an increasing number of languages.
I know. I spend all week building the most sophisticated, beautiful thing, and then I go home proud of myself, and on Monday I find out that a 13-year-old in Poughkeepsie, New York just turned it into a button, and now everyone has one, right? How do you deal with this virtual cornucopia of tools that are constantly showing up on our doorsteps on a daily basis? I've basically just taken that as an acceptance of an acceptable level of churn, right, for one. And then after a while, what you start realizing when you're looking at assessing new toolkits, they're just tools. And my focus, and there's something that I've been trying to push inside of CapitalOne as well, is it's maybe not necessarily about the tool, but the toolbox. Is the toolbox handy? Does it have what I need at the moment I need it? And that seems to be a much more logical strategy for these kind of decisions. There's always going to be a new language. There's always going to be, I'm in a small group. There's like 18 of us in the Tech Fellows, and we have one person that's really big on Ruby because it's a very expressive language. Right? I always tease the PHP guys. I always say, well, PHP isn't a real language until it has an else, or what was it? Unless, there you go, thank you. That was my punchline for a couple of years until you try to debug a nice line that at the very end has an unless, and you're like, oh man, that's it, it's all off. But yeah, there's always going to be a bunch of different people with different mentalities, different approaches in the way they do things, and so these tools will proliferate. The ethos inside of CapitalOne, at least, would seem to be, let the groups use the tools that they're productive using and that they have competence in and they have confidence in, and that's probably going to be an infinitely better value to the business than forcing everybody to use VB script or, whatever. I'm not necessarily picking on VB script; it's just that came out. All right, one last question, then I'm going to stop. My advice is 3 things. Ask about onboarding and say, this was my experience onboarding, and it was substandard, right? Suboptimal, I think that's a correct term, right? Second thing is to get involved in trying to build like special interest groups inside of your organization. So there's a Python meetup, and there's a Ruby meetup, and a Java meetup, and whatnot. Try to get practices talking to each other. People, bird of a feather kind of deal. And then the third is try to get involved in hackathons from a corporate perspective. What I've had a lot of fun at CapitalOne is we're involved in some huge hackathons. We had a hackathon 2 weeks ago. I had like 600 people show up, and our heads almost popped because we had no way we were going to handle all these people. So those are another really great way to kind of bridge that divide. So I've gone over. Actually, I went from going too fast to too slow. So thank you very much.